With all the information about the ancient sword god in his mind, Jason finally understood what kind of existence this ancient sword god was, and was deeply moved by his deeds. The name of this ancient sword god is Moxin. He is a powerful man who lived countless thousands of years ago. He has been extremely talented since he was a child. When he was born, he was a powerful man at the level of a lower spiritual god. It is said that on the day he was born, the world of gods, thousands of miles of red clouds and thunder roared in the sky, as if the end was coming, and all the swords in the nearly 10,000 miles area where he was located could not help but scream and tremble. After a long time, they slowly calmed down. Such visions naturally attracted the attention of many powerful people in the world of gods. Some people thought that a shocking artifact was born, while others thought that a peerless demon came. For a time, countless powerful people came here to search for it. Fortunately, the family that Mosin belongs to is one of the best in this area. Naturally, Mosin's birth was suppressed by them and no one knew about it. However, Moxin was born as a low-ranking spiritual god, which made the old patriarch of the family amazing and secretly cultivated him. In their original plan, they waited until Moxin was 5 or 6 years old before they started teaching the family's martial arts. Regarding his cultivation, what the old patriarch of the family did not expect was that, since Moxin was born, he did not need to practice deliberately. He was able to absorb the spiritual energy of heaven and earth at a speed far exceeding that of ordinary people. This result directly led to Mosin breaking through the middle level of God at the age of 3, becoming a high-ranking spiritual god at the age of 8, and becoming the youngest star god in the family at the age of 15. At this age, even among the gods in the hundreds of millions of years of history of the world, it is also extremely rare. Can be called a monster. What made the family patriarch even more unexpected was that Mosin had been attached to swords since he was a child. Various swords with different attributes and auras were like docile cats in his hands. Become softer and restrained. Therefore, when Mosin was promoted to star god at the age of 15, although his strength could only be considered average in the family, he had already become the family's top master in terms of understanding of swordsmanship. His understanding of swordsmanship was astonishing to even the old clan leader who was at the peak of Sun Yao God's peak, and he was ashamed of himself. In this situation, Mosin became the family's favorite and one of the successors to the family's next patriarch. However, Mosin's ideal is not like this. His obsession with swordsmanship transcends everything, even family love. When he was promoted to the Moonlight God at the age of 21, he left the family alone, refused the old patriarch's offer to stay, and began to wander in the world of gods. In the god realm, a world full of powerful people, he has such a terrifying artistic conception in the way of swordsmanship. He soon made a name for himself in his area, and his reputation spread throughout the area. However, because his family hid him, no one in the entire god realm knew where he came from. Which family are you a member of? The fight between life and death, the broadening of horizons. As Mosin became more and more accomplished in swordsmanship, he seemed like a trapped dragon soaring into the sky from the shallows. His dazzling light blossomed, and at the age of 30, Mosin was promoted to the sun god. After being promoted to the sun god, he did not return to his family. At that time, he was like a prodigal son, bent on pursuing the limit of the avenue. He walked out of his family's domain and began to cross the world of gods, starting his legend. Journey of. At that time, the god realm had a more sinister environment and a vaster territory than it does now. Strong men emerged in large numbers. A large number of masters fell every moment. Even those as weak as the saint-level masters and as strong as the Sun Yao god at his peak could not see clearly. For his own future, in such an environment, Mosin became more and more courageous as he fought. At the age of 40, he reached the peak of the sun god and became a famous master in the world of gods. However, his strength stopped at this step. From the peak of Sun Yao god to the invincibility of Sun Yao god, Mosin thought he would reach it soon, but what he didn't expect was that this step would take him a full 100 years. Time cannot be crossed. 100 years may be a fleeting time for an ordinary spiritual god, but for Mosen, who was promoted from a lower spiritual god to the peak of the sun god at the age of 40, it is a long time. Moxin, who had a smooth life since childhood and didn't know what setbacks were, finally became confused. He wandered in the world of gods for hundreds of years, constantly collecting divine swords under the world, comprehending the sword's intention, and using a long sword to traverse the world, constantly fighting. Finally, in his 800th year of wandering in the god realm, he suddenly got tired of it. After the First World War, he silently put away his sword and began his journey home. Over the past 1,000 years, a millennium of time has passed by like a fleeting moment. For nearly 1,000 years, Mosen has devoted himself to seeking the truth and has never returned home. He has never thought about his parents or family. However, when he returned to his family, he discovered that the original location of the family has long since become a ruin. It turned out that in the 500th year after he left home, his family offended another large family and was exterminated. The entire family, from the patriarch and direct descendants to slaves and maids, with a population of tens of thousands, were all killed. No one left alive. But at that time, he was on the other side of the world of gods, fighting and killing complete strangers in pursuit of his so-called Tao. Mosen cried. He knelt on the ruins of his family and cried silently. Tears kept falling from the corners of his eyes. His heart seemed to be completely broken at this moment. This kind of pain was something he had never felt before. Arrived. At this moment, he, a man who was born only to seek the truth, understood what love was for the first time. Unfortunately, it was already too late. He knelt silently on the ruins of his family for 3 days and 3 nights. His hair turned gray overnight. The peak of the sun god, which he had been unable to break through for hundreds of years, actually transformed at this moment and entered the realm of the god of invincibility. Once the wish of nearly 1,000 years was fulfilled, there was no joy in his heart, and there was only a dead silence in his heart. After many inquiries, he finally found out that the person who destroyed his family back then was actually the master of the palace in this area. The master of the palace is the most powerful person in charge of the domain under the command of the God King. He is usually the messenger of the God King and has a great relationship with the God King in that domain. After learning the news, Moxin did not feel the slightest fluctuation in his heart. Move forward resolutely. A massacre that shocked the entire world of gods occurred. One late night, Mosen came to the palace lord's city alone, sneaked into the inner fort, and instantly killed the palace lord, who was also an invincible powerhouse of the sun god with his supreme sword power, and even made the palace lord not even signal for help. There was no time to send it out, and then the horrifying massacre began. Overnight, the entire palace lord's family, with a population of tens of thousands, was killed. Corpses were scattered all over the field, and blood flowed into rivers. However, the palace lord's head was hung high on the top of the city wall, fluttering in the wind, which was horrifying to watch. This battle shocked the entire world of gods. Slaughtering the envoys of the God King, the master of a palace, and annihilating the whole family, this kind of thing has almost never happened in the god realm except for the war between the God Kings. The God King Moro of this domain was furious, identified the murderer Mosen, and began a pursuit across several domains. In this battle, there were 3 invincible and powerful messengers of the fallen God King Moro, the Sunyao god, more than 10 peak Sunyao gods, and countless ordinary Sunyao gods, but they still failed to keep Moxin, and he was finally furious. The clone of God King Moro came and took action personally. Just when everyone thought that Moxin was bound to die, what no one expected was that after an earth-shattering battle, the clone of God King Moro was actually killed by Moxin with his supreme sword power. Mosen was seriously injured and escaped. This battle caused a complete sensation in the god realm and caused an uproar throughout the world. Killing the clone of the God King in the realm of gods has never happened before in the realm of gods. In an instant, almost all the forces in the god realm were looking for Moxin, but he completely disappeared from the god realm as if he had never appeared before. Some people think that he fell, some think that he was found by the furious god King Moro and tortured forever, others think that he took refuge in other god kings who were hostile to god King Moro, but no one can prove it. Gradually, with the passage of time, people's search for Mosin slowly faded away, but his legend was passed down forever. At this moment, Jason, who had received the inheritance of the ancient sword god Mosin, understood that. After the war, where did Mosin go after disappearing? Not only did he not fall, but he worked hard to climb to a higher peak. I have been extremely talented throughout my life, but I have regretted it all my life. I should have died forever and met my relatives, but my great revenge has not been avenged. The enemy is not destroyed. How can we go away? If you want to take revenge, you can only achieve the supreme god king. However, there are 8 god kings between heaven and earth. The rest of the supreme gods are only invincible, because there are only 3 gods in the world. With the heart of the 8 god kings, I am unwilling to give in. I am willing to use the sword as the foundation and the god body as the stone to break through the shackles and become the god king. But gods will trick people. At the last moment, I fall short and my body and soul disappear. My successor, now I will pass on my lifelong insights to you, and I hope you can fulfill my last wish. The rumbling roar seemed to be echoing in Jason's mind at this moment, making Jason couldn't help but sigh. Beyond the way of heaven, not seeking the heart of the god king, but using the sword to transform the way, self-gathering the heart of the god king, and becoming the 9th god king between heaven and earth. This kind of domineering and arrogant act is truly rare and has never been seen in the ages. Jason murmured, with inexplicable admiration in his eyes, and soon his gaze became extremely determined. Senior Mosin sword god, your great enemy, god King Moro, has long fallen into history, and his great revenge has been avenged. May your soul rest in peace, but I, Jason, have a great hatred, and I will definitely destroy your sword. The divine sword intent will be passed on and will never be erased. As if he heard Jason's words, the entire divine sword tomb rumbled, and thousands of rainbow lights crisscrossed the sky and earth, shining and echoing in response. At this moment, the entire sword tomb seemed to have suddenly come to life. The countless divine swords buried in it rose up to the sky, and after being silent for countless thousands of years, they once again bloomed with their dazzling brilliance. What's going on? Why do all these divine swords seem to have revived? The remaining 20 or so star gods were kneeling at the foot of many sword mountains, looking in front of them in horror. All around them, the mountains and plains were trembling and wailing. The long sword, the vast artistic conception diffused, made their bodies tremble uncontrollably, and they felt their own insignificance from deep in their hearts. No, the inheritance of the ancient sword god has really been obtained by this boy. The lake of sword intent is now empty. Only a milky white light mask still shines at the bottom of the lake, and the surrounding area is empty. What was there before in the center of the large pit in the lake? Shura and others looked at Jason below, with anger, fear, doubt, and many other expressions in their eyes, constantly flashing. No one among them is a fool. Everything that happened in the sword tomb made them all understand that the inheritance of this ancient sword god may have been obtained by Jason. Damn, why is this happening? When did this kid get the inheritance? Shura gritted his teeth and said, his eyes red, full of murderous intent. On the side, Bottoms, Nishizawa, and others looked at each other in confusion, their eyes filled with anger. Also with confusion and anger. Originally, in their imagination, only the 5 of them were undergoing the assessment in the Lake of Sword Intent, and the inheritance of the ancient sword god would definitely fall on them. The real battle must take place at the last moment, and each of them is still thinking about it. How to hide their strength and let the others fight to the death, and finally become the fishermen again. However, the appearance of Jason shattered all their previous thoughts, leaving them with only despair in their hearts. In the void, Caesar's gloomy eyes looked coldly at Jason below, his eyes flickering. I don't know what he was thinking, but suddenly, His figure suddenly disappeared into the void. Caesar's actions also attracted the attention of Bottoms and others. Kill. As long as we kill this kid, the inheritance of this ancient sword god will still be ours. Kill him. After killing him, we still have a chance. Yes, let's go together. I don't believe it, we have several people join forces, they won't be able to kill him. Before he can fully understand the ancient sword god's inheritance, kill him here. Bottoms, Shura, and others all spoke out angrily, and at the same time a terrifying aura rose from their bodies. It seemed that they were about to take action against Jason below, but before they could finish speaking one by one, whoosh. Whoosh. There was still excitement and anger in between. The four menacing Bottoms actually turned around at the same time, soared into the sky, and flew towards the sword god, sword tomb in all directions. The four of them flew by like lightning at the same time, trying to escape from here as fast as possible. However, their previous indignant instigation only caused others to take action. These guys are really cunning. Bottom's whole body turned into a stream of flames, flying quickly, while looking at the figures of Shura and Ian, he gritted his teeth. As the moonlight gods, none of them are fools. They had already realized how powerful Jason was. One-on-one was no match for him. Even if the five of them joined forces, they were unable to do anything to him. Now the opponent has obtained the ancient weapon. The inheritance of the sword god has made a breakthrough in strength. Only an idiot would believe that killing him can get the inheritance. The actions of Bottoms and others also woke up Jason, who was full of emotion at the bottom of the lake. He raised his head, and his eyes suddenly opened, blooming with two bright lights. Boom! Jason just stood there, not taking any action yet, but he was already exuding a powerful energy, and a terrifying artistic conception rising into the sky, like a long river, straight into the sky. At this moment, he was like a real dragon awakening, waking up after sleeping for eternity. In an instant, he exuded a terrifying consciousness that was indestructible. Is this the inheritance of the ancient sword god? How could this kid become so terrifying? This aura is incredible. It should have been mine. Jason's eyes looked to the sky, like a long sword unsheathed, the sharp edge was sharp, like two bright lightnings, sweeping across the sky. Bottoms, Shura, and others felt Jason's gaze. Their bodies were shaken, their backs were cold, and cold sweat was dripping. That kind of look looking at it, it looks like the eternal God King is standing proudly, looking down on the people. Boom! Suddenly, Jason took a step forward, and the sky trembled, as if it was about to collapse under his step. Under Jason's feet, thousands of miles of energy emerged, and a series of avenue runes appeared. The whole person seemed to teleport, and he could move with just one step. He came to Dewey, one of the only two remaining Yueshi gods. Everyone was startled, with chills all over their bodies and out of their wits. Jason's speed was too fast, beyond their limit. The terrifying energy generated here also attracted the attention of all the starry gods in the sword tomb in the distance. They all raised their heads and looked around. Jason stood proudly, glaring coldly at Dewey in front of him, with no concealment of his murderous intent. Although he had just been promoted to the Moonlight God, his true combat power had already transcended this level, and could accommodate the supreme sword intent, reaching a level that ordinary people could not imagine. Unimaginable realm. What do you want to do? Dewey, who was escaping from here quickly, never thought that Jason would be so fast. He suddenly stopped, with a trembling look of horror on his face, and said, "What are you doing?" The aura emanating from Sen's body made him, a powerful man at the peak of the Moonlight Sky God, feel depressed and his body almost collapsed. Kill you. Jason's words were plain, simple, and direct. After the words fell, he punched out directly, simple and plain, without any fancy. Boom. As if the God King stretched out his fist, Jason punched out. It seemed ordinary, but it contained the supreme law of the Tao, which made people change their colors. Countless spiritual energy in the world gathered crazily towards his fist. This is a punch that contains the general trend of heaven and earth. In the distance, when everyone saw this horrific scene, their livers and gallbladders were split, and their scalps were all numb. This power was shocking. Yu was shocked and turned pale. He tried his best to resist. Infinite divine power surged out of his body like an erupting volcano. It erupted desperately and blasted towards Jason, while at the same time the whole person quickly retreated. However, the overwhelming divine power surged forward, and Jason's fist blasted into the overwhelming divine power. It was as if it was devastating, as if he was in a deserted land. Before Dui even retreated, he saw a jade-like weapon shining with the luster of jade. The fist came to him. Pung! Dui roared in despair, his body collapsed, and blood splattered all over the sky. Before he even made the slightest move, Jason blasted him directly into the void, shattering his body into pieces. Buzz! In the void, Dui's incomplete head rose into the sky. Jason's punch shattered his body, but did not destroy his soul. His eyes were filled with horror as he retreated at a rapid speed. Everyone, let's kill him together, otherwise none of us will be able to escape. Dui yelled crazily, condensing his divine power, trying to condense his body again, full of fear. Poof! What responded to him was Jason's second punch. After the blow, a river of divine power flowed. The broken head opened with horrified eyes and turned into powder directly in the river, destroying both body and soul. A divine chain of laws fell from it weakly and was taken into Jason's hands. Not far away, when Bottoms, Shura and Ian saw this scene, their faces were full of fear, their bodies trembled, and they fled desperately. Especially Ian, who fled to the same side as Dui, was even more frightened, desperately using secret techniques to increase speed to the extreme. However, a figure walked towards him in the void. It seemed very slow, but it left a blurry afterimage. He took 2 steps and arrived in front of Ian in the blink of an eye. Let him go with him. An indifferent voice sounded. Jason's eyes were cold. A fist appeared, shattering the universe, penetrating the 3 realms and 9 heavens, and traversing the hell on earth. No matter how Ian resisted or roared, it was of no avail. A punch penetrated him, and blood sprayed 10 meters high. Nothing could withstand it. Ian's own weapon was originally in front of him, but was blown to pieces by Jason's punch. It was completely destroyed and nothing existed anymore. Do! Ian suddenly roared, and the air wave turned into a rainbow, and the divine power rippled, forming a hurricane and sweeping toward Jason. At the same time, he quickly retreated, and a chi that resembled the awakening of a wild ancient beast surged out of his body. Death! 2 divine rainbows shot out from Jason's eyes. He opened his big hand and tore open a sky curtain. Suddenly, terrifying sword intent surged out of his body, turning into a dragon-shaped rainbow light that penetrated directly through Ian's body. Poof! Blood continued to splatter, Ian's expression froze, his eyes were dull, his body was cracked inch by inch, and his head exploded. The sword intent all over the sky dissipated, and Jason's figure washed through the void. Only Ian's body was left in place, with broken bones and blood constantly scattered. In the distance, all the star gods who saw this scene widened their eyes. The entire Sword God Sword tomb was silent, and they were so shocked that they couldn't even speak. What kind of characters are Ian and Dui? They are not weak among the Moonlight gods. They have a great reputation in this area of the wild ancient land, but they were blasted by Jason's punch. They had no power to resist. They died so tragically, as if they were fragile. 1 strike. Everyone was shocked and frightened. Their faces were pale, their eyes were flashing, and their hearts were filled with extreme fear. When Jason suddenly took action, was he just going to deal with a few great Yuhui gods, or was he going to take action against all the powerful men in the entire Sword God Sword tomb? This thought rose in everyone's hearts like a ghost, making them all tremble uncontrollably. If it was a second thought, with their Xingyao Tianqin's strength, would they still have a way to survive? At this moment, everyone felt extremely regretful about entering this sword god sword tomb. For a moment, everyone was shocked and frightened. Their expressions changed and their hearts trembled to the extreme. How could he be so powerful? Has he already entered the realm of the sun god? Many people murmured to themselves, their mouths dry and their hearts full of fear. They wanted to escape, but they were helpless. The sword god sword tomb sent them in through a special formation. There was only an entrance and no exit. Even if they wanted to escape, there was no way out. Bottoms felt extremely regretful. He and the other party were quite friendly before, but in the end he took action for the sake of inheritance and forced the other party to a dead end. Now that the other party has returned strongly, it is so powerful that it makes Bottoms uneasy and fearful. With a bang, the sky and the earth roared, and the battlefield was torn apart. Jason looked around like a god, turned into a stream of light and rushed towards Shura and Bottoms. His invincible momentum soared into the sky, forming a dragon-shaped true energy between the sky and the earth. Magnificent and domineering. In the floating light, Shura and Bottoms had already rushed towards where they were when they arrived. They were far away in the sky, and they were flying away at an astonishing speed. However, Jason came from behind and never escaped into the void, but just traveled between heaven and earth, like a stream of light flashing across the sky, with an astonishing speed. Shrinking the ground into an inch, with every step Jason took, avenue runes appeared under his feet, as if he was walking on the veins of heaven and earth, so fast that it was unimaginable. The sky exploded, and Jason took the lead. Just now, he killed Ian and Dewey in one fell swoop, which shocked everyone's hearts. Seeing him turn around and come to kill them now, Shura and Bottoms felt terrified in their hearts, and their hair shivered. It is raised. Where to go? Jason suddenly roared, the void shook, the world trembled, the whole void seemed to be unable to accommodate his true body, the mighty divine power swept over. Jason raised his fist to kill, five-color divine light containing the ultimate sword intent, it penetrated the void and struck directly behind Shura. Boom! Endless coercion spread, and at this moment Shura had arrived above the sword mountain. Several of the prostrate Xingyao gods nearby fell one by one under Jason's coercion, with blood spurting out of their mouths, unable to resist. Wait a minute! The bright divine rainbow surged in, and Shura, who was running away quickly, was shocked out of his mind. He screamed, but before he could finish his words, overwhelming divine power surged in, and Shura's body, suddenly a dazzling golden light bloomed, and the golden long sword was unsheathed, turning into a golden dragon and sweeping forward. Chong! The sound of gold and iron fighting rang out, and the golden sword trembled. Cracks appeared. Shura suddenly felt like a truck hit by a high speed. His whole body was thrown heavily, and blood was thrown into the air. Everyone in the entire sword tomb looked at everything with dull expressions. They still clearly remembered that before the opening of the sword god sword tomb, the contest between Jason and Shura was still evenly matched, regardless of each other. Even Jason was slightly inferior, falling behind. But at this moment, Jason knocked Shura away with one punch, and the opponent had almost no power to fight back. Everyone was shocked. Shura's eyes were filled with fear, and the skin on his body was cracked by Jason's previous blow. He was coughing up blood in his mouth, looking extremely embarrassed. "Spare your life, Your Excellency, spare your life!" Shura shouted in horror, but what was waiting for him was Jason's iron fist. Poof! The jade-like fist penetrated the heaven and the earth, directly punching Shura. Blood splashed everywhere, bones were broken, tendons were broken, and the body was shattered. This Shura had revealed his murderous intention towards him before entering the sword god sword tomb. How could he leave this person alive? He didn't want to let go of any of the people who had dealt with him in the past. "I'll fight you!" Shura roared with a pair of bloody eyes. In the roar, golden light rainbows surged from his body, forming small golden swords in the void, buzzing and trembling. With Although these small swords are small, they exude fierce energy. Around these small swords, tiny cracks are formed in the void. It is difficult to withstand the erosion of this sword intention. In the sky, thousands of golden small swords form a line. This is a unique world of swords, where the sword intent spreads all over the sky. Some of the divine swords in the sword mountain below were shattered by this sword intent due to the passage of time. Boom! The small golden sword in the sky turned into a torrent, sweeping toward Jason, vast and endless. Little trick. Looking at the golden sword in the sky and the terrifying sword intent emanating from it, a sneer suddenly appeared on Jason's lips. Having obtained the ancient sword god's inheritance and all the sword intent that Shura himself understood was as ridiculous as a child playing house. Let me show you what the true sword intent is. A cold voice came from Jason's mouth, and a monster sword intent was suddenly released from his body. Boom! This sword intention was released just a little bit, and the heaven and earth roared loudly. It was like the world was coming, and a terrifying force that seemed to come from the ancient times came out and scattered between the heaven and the earth. Wow! Like an ant meeting a divine dragon, as soon as Jason released his sword intent, the sword intent released by Shura suddenly exploded, and a terrifying sword intent was like a torrent, covering Shura's body. Ah! Shura screamed in agony at the end. The genius who was known as Ling Huang Pavilion's most promising person to become the sun god, his divine body cracked open and was completely annihilated. Death! Jason shouted loudly, and rushed towards Bottoms again. He was like a god and demon rushing out of hell, breaking free from the shackles, killing everyone in all directions. No one could challenge him, and he was invincible. Bottoms felt extremely regretful and ran away as fast as he could, while begging Jason for mercy. However, no matter how he begged for mercy, Jason's face remained unchanged. Thunder struck, blood sprayed in the void, and white bone stubble splashed everywhere. This scene is very terrifying. Jason is invincible and unstoppable. He completely beats Bottoms up with a few punches. Just when everyone thought the massacre was about to end, Jason snatched Caesar out of the void and killed him with one sword. In this sword god sword tomb, Jason, who had received the inheritance of the ancient sword god, could not escape his perception no matter how strong he was. In the sky, Jason stood proudly like a demon. His hands were stained with blood. There was a strong smell of blood in the sky. The more than 20 star gods below were all frightened, but they didn't even dare to run away. Pfft! Jason looked down and pointed out with one finger. 2 of the more than 20 star gods had blood holes on their foreheads. Their eyes widened and they fell down in despair with their heads raised. These 2 people were the spirit gods. Master Feiluan of Huang Pavilion and another powerful Xingyao celestial god. After doing all this, Jason stepped out, disappeared in the sky in an instant, and returned to the bottom of the lake of sword intent. Jason's departure also made the more than 20 Xingyao Tianshan warriors below take a long breath. Only then did they feel that their backs had already been soaked with sweat from the sword intent. At the bottom of the lake, Jason suppressed the excitement in his heart and walked into the last light barrier. There was what he dreamed of. Boom! The light shield opened, and Jason's eyes instantly fell on the open space in front of him. There, a piece of dusk mist flowed, and a sword-shaped, colorful glass light shone, suspended in the air. This is a small sword made purely of energy. It is about 3 inches long, crystal clear, and exudes a strong aura of divine power. However, this is not the key. The most important thing is that there is a huge aura on this small sword. Revealed, this aura was strong and upright, giving Jason the feeling of directly facing the rules of the avenue. Buzz buzz at the same time, the black heavy sword behind Jason also trembled at this moment. A strong force of attraction was transmitted from the colorful sword, seeming to attract all the heavy swords behind him. It is to attract the past. When Jason first entered the sword god sword tomb, the attraction he felt was transmitted from the colorful swords under the lake of sword intent. This is the sword intention of the ancient sword god Moxin. Jason sighed, knowing in his heart that this small colorful glazed sword was exactly what the ancient sword god Moxin was preparing to use when he attacked the realm of the God King. The heart of the God King, condensed by the understanding of swordsmanship, unfortunately fell short in the end. His own divine power turned into the sword intent all over the lake, and the incomplete heart of the God King condensed also turned into the shape of a sword and was left at the bottom of the lake. Buzz! Jason stretched out his hand, and the colorful sword suddenly turned into a stream of light and fell into his heart. Jason thought for a moment and merged the colorful sword into the trembling black heavy sword. In the nearly 1 year at the Sword God Sword Tomb, Jason has almost understood the sword intent of the ancient sword god. After receiving the inheritance from the ancient sword god, his understanding of the sword is now extremely thorough. In addition, Jason himself has the heart of the God King of the East Pole God King Stern in his body. Jason no longer needs the heart of the half-step God King that the ancient sword god failed to condense. Moreover, the ancient sword god Mozin's path of condensing the heart of the God King also gave Jason a lot of inspiration. Even if Jason takes another path in the future, he will follow his own path instead of following the ancient sword god. Mozin's path continues. Under Jason's gaze, the black heavy sword that was originally trembling slightly absorbed the small colorful glazed sword. Suddenly there was a loud roar, and bright colorful sword lights shot into the sky, shocking the world. The so-called artifacts are actually except for some special weapons that require unique materials and refining methods. The vast majority of artifacts are formed by relying on their respective masters to continuously nourish them with powerful divine power for countless years, and finally merge with them. Just like a low-grade artifact, as long as a low-level spiritual god uses the low-level divine power to continuously nourish it, it can last for hundreds of years. After 1,000 years, even if it is made of ordinary materials, with the nourishment of divine power, it will naturally become a lower-level artifact. And this black épée? It was the black épée that Jason got when he was in the Kingdom of Orlando. It still gave Jason a lot of surprises, until now. When Jason penetrated the black heavy sword with his spiritual consciousness, he was still able to hide an extremely powerful and unique power in the deepest part of the black heavy sword. Obviously, this black heavy sword is not an ordinary thing, but these Jason continued to nurture it over the years, and this black épée seemed to have become a part of Jason, indispensable. Rumble. The black épée kept roaring, suspended in mid-air, exuding bright power, and apparently absorbing and integrating the heart of the ancient sword god. Jason stopped caring about it at the moment, and instead set his sights on a platform not far away. There, several soft sword-shaped spiritual grasses are growing there. There are 3 plants in total, swaying gently in the breeze, full of the rhythm of the avenue, and the fragrance of elixirs is constantly passed on, refreshing the heart and mind. Every pore in Jason's body seemed to relax in an instant. Jason gently took 3 sword-shaped elixirs that were only a few inches high into his hands. The breath of life exuded from them could be seen from Jason's accomplishments as a medicine god at a glance. This was the top-grade god he had always dreamed of. Medicine. If all the essences of the 3 high-grade magical medicines are absorbed by Blue Moon Gusen, based on the 100-year efficacy of 1 high-grade magical medicine, it is conservatively estimated that Jason will not need to know how to use them for at least hundreds of years. Lanui Gusen was worried about his life. It takes time for Lanui Gusen to absorb the high-grade magic medicine, and I also need to fully understand and thoroughly understand the sword rules passed down to me by the ancient sword god Mozin. Jason said silently in his heart, and then raised his head. The sky above the sword tomb was filled with blue waves, and the rich aura of the sword diffused in the air, giving Jason an extremely comfortable feeling. This sword god sword tomb can be regarded as a good retreat place. Jason murmured, in that case, huh? Jason waved his hand suddenly. Boom! An extremely powerful aura dispersed, and 7 long swords suddenly appeared in the sky, divided into 7 star positions, floating beside Jason. These 7 long swords were the same 7 long swords that led Jason and the others into the Lake of Sword Intent to undergo the assessment. After Caesar and others were killed by Jason, these 7 long swords naturally fell into Jason's hands. In fact, these 7 long swords were forged by the ancient sword god Mosin, who gathered rare objects from all over the world, and incorporated his natal sword intention. The 7 long swords can be combined to form a unique sword formation. The 7 god-killing sword formation is invincible. It was a great weapon used by the ancient sword god Mosin to dominate the world. At the same time, these 7 long swords are also the hub and key of the sword god sword tomb, which can control the sword god sword tomb. On, off. Now that I have obtained the inheritance of the ancient sword god, let all the others who entered the sword tomb leave the sword tomb. Jason muttered to himself, with a flash of light in his eyes and a wave of his hand. Huh! The 7 long swords suddenly bloomed with bright light. 7 rays of light surged from the long swords, and finally gathered at one point in the sky. Amidst the rumbling and roaring sounds, the entire sword god sword tomb trembled. Get up, the colorful aurora appears in the void. What's going on? No. In the Sword Mountain not far away, the remaining 20 or so star gods raised their heads in horror. At the same time, a huge suction force enveloped them, sweeping them into the channel opened in the sky. Outside the sword god sword tomb, a large number of people are stationed here, looking at the sword god sword tomb in the distance from time to time. These people are the major forces that originally tried to enter the sword god sword tomb. In addition, there are also some powerful people who have received news from other regions in the past year. When the sword god sword tomb was opened, there was a huge uproar here. Many strong men gathered and tried to enter the sword god sword tomb. In the end, only the 18 forces with the sword god order entered it and won this honor. It took nearly a year to enter. During this year, many forces have set up strongholds here, always monitoring the movements of the sword god's sword tomb. After all, no one will be unmoved by the sword tomb of a powerful ancient sun god. At this moment, in a mountain calm not far from the sword god's sword tomb, 2 middle spirit gods were sitting cross-legged, staring at the location of the sword god sword tomb from time to time. Second brother, a person who is a direct descendant of the Alliance. He actually left a treasure here. You know, although our ancient wild land is barren, there have been many powerful people in these countless years. People have gathered here, but no one has ever seen that there is a treasure here, which is really strange. One of them said with confusion on his face. How did I know that the news coming out of the sword god sword tomb in just 2 years should not be false? Another person shook his head. Every time news comes out, masters from all the major forces appear. I also heard that 7 powerful men from the Moonlight God entered, including Shura, the genius of Linghuang Pavilion. Sir, there are also the young master of Fire Cloud Castle, Bottoms, and the Shadow Killer Shiza from the Shadow Killing Alliance. Although they are only Moonlight Gods, they are famous in our ancient wilderness, and they are the most promising ones to become Sunlight Gods. It has been almost a year since a group of geniuses entered this sword god sword tomb, and there is no news at all. Will there be any accidents? The man murmured to himself, and was suddenly startled. Maybe, this sword god sword tomb. The tomb was designed by a strong man in order to wipe out all the geniuses in our wild ancient land. As soon as these words came out, the man's face suddenly glowed with an extraordinary light, as if he had guessed some shocking secret. Yes, maybe it is really possible. Second brother, if we tell the superiors about this possibility, what reward will the superiors give us? Reward? Reward for enzymes. The crocodile looked like a sheepish man and said, I've been thinking wildly and daydreaming. When this sword god sword tomb was first opened, I heard that a strong Sun Yao Tian god wanted to attack it. Everyone who entered it failed to succeed and retreated with serious injuries. If someone really planned this sword god sword tomb, then at least a strong person at the level of the sun god would have this ability. Although Master Shura and Master Bothams who entered it were strong, it's just the Yuhui god. If there are really powerful sunlight gods who want to deal with them, they can just do it directly. There is no need to go to all the trouble. That's right. The man smiled naively and was about to say something else when he heard boom. A deafening roar resounded throughout the world. The whole world seemed to be shaking under this loud noise. The sword in front of them that had been silent for a year, the divine sword tomb, suddenly bloomed with a colorful rainbow at this moment. There is a situation. There is a situation in the sword divine tomb. Reported to the superiors, quickly. The two people had shock on their faces, and the next moment they jumped up and roared loudly. At the same time, the huge changes that took place in the Sword God Sword Tomb also attracted the attention of all the major forces outside the Sword God Sword Tomb. The entire perimeter of the Sword God Sword Tomb suddenly began to boil. Whizzing. Whoosh. One after another figures rose into the sky, looking at the Sword God Sword Tomb in front of them with solemn expressions on their faces. Is the Sword God Sword Tomb finally going to be opened again? It's been a year, almost a year, and I don't know who has obtained the inheritance. But no matter who it is, we have to find a way to get a share of it. Many people's hearts were racing with thoughts, their eyes were constantly turning, and all the major forces had their own thoughts floating in their minds. Boom! In everyone's shocked eyes, a colorful passage suddenly appeared in the originally empty void, and immediately, a figure spat out from it. As soon as these people came out, countless powerful men rose into the sky and surrounded them from a distance. That's Lean, the strongest man in the Hydak family. Delisa, the leader of the Shillong Adventure Group. Wallace, the lord of the Wilderness City. One after another figures flew through the colorful passages. When he came out, everyone he knew around him shouted loudly. In the blink of an eye, nearly 20 powerful men at the level of Star God had already flown out. However, those powerful men waiting outside the Sword God Sword Tomb where he stared at the door of the passage for a moment. Those who appear now are only powerful ones at the level of the Star God. There are 7 moonlight gods who entered the Sword God Sword Tomb on this trip. Everyone knows that if someone really gets the inheritance of the ancient Sword God fish, the biggest the probability is that they will be born among the 7 moonlight gods, so they are waiting for the appearance of those 7 people. Why are all the powerful ones coming out now? The colorful passages kept shining. Just as everyone was wondering and waiting anxiously, after spitting out 23 powerful Xingyao sky gods, the colorful passages it actually slowly closed under everyone's gaze, and finally closed completely, and the entire void became calm again. This scene that was beyond everyone's expectations immediately stunned many strong men present. Phew! Many people have observed that after seeing the passage closed, the 23 Xingyao celestial powerhouses that spewed out from it all exhaled heavily, with a hint of happiness on their faces that they had survived the disaster. However, after seeing the many powerful men surrounding them, the brows of the more than 20 Xingyao gods all frowned. Everyone, what are you doing? One of them shouted coldly. Master Patriarch. City Lord. The members of the 23 strong men's forces rushed forward one after another after seeing their respective adults. Some of the forces that had strong men entering the Sword God Sword Tomb at the beginning also rushed forward after seeing no one from their own side, also rushed up. Chief Lean, why are you the only ones left, my master? Why isn't the leader of our diamond village here? The strong men of these forces also shouted loudly, their eyes were red, and a bad feeling floated in their hearts. For a moment, the whole scene was extremely chaotic, but they were able to obtain the Sword God Order and enter the Sword God Sword. All of Zhong's forces are major forces in the vicinity. The remaining 23 Xingyao gods and powerful men unite and add their respective subordinates to form an extremely huge force. The 23 Xingyao gods, the gods looked at each other, secretly reaching some kind of agreement. Get out of the way, everyone, get out of our way. Many Xingyao gods shouted loudly at the same time, and with their own men, a large group of people immediately wanted to fly away from here. Such a huge force, although most of the people present had their own thoughts in their hearts. Thoughts they wanted to intercept, but no one dared to take the lead in attacking such a huge joint force, so they could only retreat continuously. Seeing that no one could stop such a group of people, flashes flashed in the eyes of some of the leaders of the surrounding forces. There was a sharp light, and just as he was about to attack, he suddenly said, "Haha. I have been lying for a whole year, but the sword god sword tomb has finally been opened again. Little children, none of you can leave, just stay here obediently." A thunderous shout resounded throughout the world. The roaring and rumbling sound made many people present unsteady, dizzy, and boiling with divine power, almost fell from the sky. Even the 23 powerful Xingyao gods turned pale under this loud laughter, their energy and blood surged, and their eyes showed horror. "Who is it? Who? Is it him?" Everyone exclaimed and looked up at the sky. In the sky, an earth-yellow stream of light swept past like lightning and appeared above everyone. The void rioted. Under the power of the boiling earth element, that the figure descended slowly. "It's him." Many people recognized him. This person was the peerless strong man who failed to catch up with the sword god sword tomb in time when it opened. He roared and wanted to split the sword god sword tomb. In an instant, everyone present was excited. Their expressions changed, and they especially still remembered the scene back then, where the sword was directed, the wind howled, the world collapsed. It was unmatched, that kind of majestic momentum, although only a strong person at the level of Sun Yao God could display it, otherwise even the Moonlight God would never have such strength. The khaki flowing shadow disappeared, and an old man with a withered face fell from the sky with a long knife on his back. His sharp eyes cut across everyone's face like a blade, and finally it fell on the faces of the 23 star gods. "All of you who came out of the sword god sword tomb should stay. All other irrelevant people should get out of here." The old man shouted coldly. "Senior," the expressions of many people present changed drastically. "What? Do you want to disobey me?" The old man said coldly, and a vast spiritual power surged out from his body. In an instant, the entire sky seemed to have a strong wind of level 12 blowing in an instant. The frightening momentum shocked everyone present. People couldn't bear it and retreated one after another. "Let's go! Let's go!" Everyone looked at each other and left the place in a panic, without the slightest thought of plundering the treasure. They were huge in number, but if a sun god wanted to kill them, it would be effortless. When they fell, there would be no place for them to reason. In an instant, all the people who had been busy before retreated completely, and nothing was left. Even the 23 members of the Xingyao Celestial Powers faction, after communicating with their respective leaders, also obediently left this place. Suddenly, the only ones left outside the sword tomb were the old man, Ku Ge, and the 23 powerful star gods. "Senior, I'm Luo Xiao, a descendant of the Luo family in Manhuang Mansion. I wonder what my senior has to say for leaving us behind." A group of people looked at each other, and a man in a green shirt walked out of them, with a calm expression and a salute. When everyone heard this, they were filled with awe. The ancient land of the wilderness is vast and has a vast territory. Among them, there are countless families named Luo. But when it comes to the Luo family of the Wilderness Prefecture, there is only the Luo family, which is known as one of the 4 major families of the Wilderness Prefecture. This Luo family is powerful and prestigious. The head of the family, Luo Shi, is a peak powerhouse of the sun god, and is also the top being in the entire ancient wilderness. In the wild ancient land, these 4 major families, together with Linghuang Pavilion, Fire Cloud Castle, Lingxiao Pavilion and other forces, are known as the 13 major forces in the wild ancient land. They are the most powerful force in the wild ancient land besides the Palace Lord and should not be underestimated. Watch for. "Baby, do you dare to threaten me?" The old man's cold face suddenly sank, and a fierce light flashed in his eyes. With a wave of his hand, Luo Xiao was suddenly out of control, and his whole figure looked like a little boy. The chicken is usually held in his hand. The Luo family of Wilderness Mansion is strong, but if I kill you, I don't believe that the Luo family would fall out with me for a little star god. The cold voice of the old man came, making everyone's bodies it's all a shudder. Especially Luo Xiao, who was being held in his hands. His face was so horrified that there was no trace of blood. He is just a concubine of the Luo family, and his status in the Luo family is not high. It was just a coincidence that he passed by here this time and occupied a piece of the Sword God token to enter the Sword God Sword Tomb. However, he did not expect that in the end, not only would he not be in the Sword God Sword Tomb, obtaining the treasure in the tomb was full of dangers. I had just escaped from the hands of the man in the Sword God Sword Tomb. After leaving the Sword God Sword Tomb, I was captured by the Blood Shadow Mad Sword again. I was extremely scared. Luo Xiao, who was born in a big family, has naturally heard of the reputation of the Blood Shadow Crazy Sword. This Blood Shadow Crazy Sword is a lone swordsman with unparalleled strength. Even among the powerful sun gods, he is not weak. In the world of gods, what many forces are most afraid of is this kind of lone strong man who lives a completely different life, has no restraints, and has no family fortune. Even big families will try to avoid messing with these people, otherwise these lone strong men will only pick on the weak children of the family. It is impossible to guard against it. No matter where to hide when the time comes, even the most powerful family will be helpless. As he said, if he was killed by the Blood Shadow Crazy Sword, even if the family would condemn him for the sake of face, they would never make an enemy of the Blood Shadow Crazy Sword just for the sake of a bastard like himself. Senior, please calm down. I have offended you before, and I hope you will forgive me. I don't know what your request is, but as long as I can fulfill it, I will never refuse. Luo Xiao, who was extremely arrogant and generous before, was frightened at this moment. He yelled hurriedly. Well, very good. The old man smiled slightly, and Luo Xiao flew out immediately, with strong energy rippling, and a trace of blood spilled from the corner of Luo Xiao's mouth. I'm looking for you, naturally, for the treasures in the Sword God Sword Tomb. The corners of the old man's mouth curled up quietly, and a cold light showed in his eyes. But when people outside the Sword Tomb were panicked and everyone was filled with fear. In the Sword God Sword Tomb, Jason was already immersed in the vast knowledge imparted by the ancient Sword God, and fell into self-cultivation. He didn't know that a huge uproar was about to sweep across the entire ancient wilderness with the force of thunder outside the Sword God Sword Tomb. In the Sword God Sword Tomb, Jason was sitting cross-legged at the bottom of the Lake of Sword Intent. The 7 divine swords were suspended in mid-air, guarded by a killing formation. Thousands of sword intent were circulating, which was astonishingly vast. Although Jason received the inheritance of the ancient sword god, absorbed all the sword intent of the ancient sword god, and became the moonlight god, the inheritance Jason received was only a kind of understanding, a kind of direction of the great road, and a kind of knowledge. And if he wants to completely transform it into his own power, he needs to continue to practice, thoroughly understand it, and integrate it into his own Tao and Dharma. In addition, Jason also placed the black heavy sword on his knees. The sword body shone with light and flowed luster. In the process of absorbing the heart of the ancient sword god and king, it continued to emit the great sword, affecting Jason. And in the open space in front of Jason, 3 high-grade sword grass plants were planted in the shape of a Chinese character. The 3-inch sacred tree, transformed by blue moon ancient sun, was gently swaying, crystal clear and shining, constantly absorbing the 3 high-grade magical medicines. The essence of the magical medicine, dissipated from the body, continues its life. Lanuigusan, please come and realize with me. Jason whispered softly, then closed his eyes tightly, completely integrated into the realization. In the outside world, under the coercion of Bahem, the bloody shadow mad sword, Luo Xiao and other 23 star gods told everything that happened in the Sword God Sword Tomb. Including the existence of the Lake of Sword Intention, the fall of Shura and others, the rise of Jason, etc., no one is left out. Blood Shadow Mad Saber Bahem naturally didn't believe this. After killing several people in succession and still getting nothing, Bahem finally believed it all and let Luo Xiao and others go. As Luo Xiao and others left, everything in the Sword God Sword tomb was quickly transmitted in this wild ancient land. One stone stirred up thousands of waves, and the entire ancient wilderness was in riot in an instant. At first, the inheritance of this ancient sword god was only passed on in the surrounding areas of the deserted city, and the arrival of Shura, Shiza, Bottoms and others was just a coincidence. However, with the arrival of Luo Xiao and others, come out. The existence of the Sword God Sword tomb was like a huge storm sweeping across the entire ancient wilderness. What is the concept of an ancient sword god with sword intent all over the lake? No one dared to imagine, and those who heard it were extremely shocked. You must know that the total sword intention understood by an ordinary sword master Yue Hui Tianshan, if it is materialized, can only be condensed into a drop of sword intention at most. And the sword intent of Ihu. Even if you gather all the god-level sword masters in the entire wild ancient land, it may not be able to be filled up. As soon as the news came out, many people naturally didn't believe it at first, but then a soul master killed one of the 23 surviving star gods. After stripping out his soul and memories, no one doubted it anymore. Almost everyone is discussing what kind of person this ancient sword god is. In comparison, although the deaths of Shura, Caesar, and Bottoms were shocking, they seemed a bit insignificant. In an instant, the eyes of the entire ancient wilderness were focused on the location of the great wilderness city. However, the Sword God Sword tomb has been closed, and no one knows how to open it, which makes many people sigh in their hearts. The Blood Shadow Crazy Sword, who was the first to get the news, launched 3 fierce attacks on the closed Sword God Sword tomb. In the end, he was seriously injured and escaped under the terrifying defense of the Sword God Sword tomb. During this process, someone naturally thought of the Tianxia Chamber of Commerce, which was related to Jason, but when they arrived at the location of the Tianxia Chamber of Commerce. However, they discovered that the Tianxia Chamber of Commerce had become an empty shell at some point, all its members had been disbanded, and all the members of the Long family were missing. Time flies by, and in the blink of an eye, a year passes quietly, and everything happens in the Sword God Sword tomb. It was also spread throughout the entire ancient wilderness through various communication channels. At this moment, in a mountain forest hundreds of millions of miles away from Dahuang City, there is a village with hundreds of households. This village is extremely remote and sparsely populated nearby. I haven't seen any pedestrians all year round, and I don't know how this village could have been built in a place like this. Far away. Suddenly a stream of light flew past and entered a house in the middle of the village. Master Patriarch, the Sword God Sword tomb is still not open, and there is no news about the predecessors. However, the great desert city has become the center of all major forces. It seems that we will not be able to go back for the time being. In the room, a middle-aged man sitting there, beside him, stood a young girl, Long Lin and Long Inue, the presidents of the Tianxia Chamber of Commerce. Father, it seems that our family has to live in seclusion here, and we don't know what happened to our senior. Long Inue said with worry on her face. It turns out that before Jason entered the Sword God Sword tomb, just in case, he asked the members of the World Chamber of Commerce to leave the great wilderness city secretly after he entered the Sword God Sword tomb, in order to prevent what would happen if there were any accident will not affect the World Chamber of Commerce. In a castle hall hundreds of millions of miles away from the great desert city, densely packed strong men were kneeling on the ground. Each of these strong men exuded an astonishing aura. At the front of the team there were several figures with terrifying auras standing on them. These figures stood on the ground. Then, the breath on his body seemed to merge with the void, vast and boundless. Such a breath can only be felt from the Sun Yao God. However, at this moment, these Sun Yao Tian God powerhouses were looking ahead tremblingly, with extremely respectful expressions. Damn it! A loud shout came. At the top of the hall, a burly man with long flaming hair suddenly stood up and punched the long table in front of him into pieces. Endless flames rose. The long table was instantly burned to ashes. Mobilize me, the masters in the castle closest to the great desert city. I remember that Longtas is nearby. I immediately sent a message to him and asked him to go to the sword god sword tomb immediately. I want to let the man who killed my son bottoms, the boy will die without a burial place. An angry roar came from the fire cloud castle and lasted for a long time. At the same time, far away on the top floor of a majestic pavilion in Manhuang Mansion, sitting around the circular conference table were a dozen imposing and powerful men. Someone actually dares to kill the genius of our Linghuang pavilion. The sword god sword tomb is a bit interesting. I will immediately send the master in the pavilion closest to Dahuang City to make sure that he gets the so-called sword god's inheritance. Kill me. The genius Shura boy from Linghuang Pavilion was captured and brought back to the headquarters. He wants to see people alive and his body after death. An old man wearing a high crown snorted coldly, the void shook, and he followed his words. At the northernmost point of the ancient wild land, there is a cold cemetery. All kinds of ghosts are rippling in the void, which is cold and dark. According to legend, there was an earth-shattering war here millions of years ago. In order to practice his magical power, an invincible dark-type sun god refined the souls of hundreds of millions of people here. That night, blood flowed into rivers and ghosts cried. God howls. Later, the news spread, and many strong men came to encircle and suppress them, but they were all killed. There were countless casualties in that battle. Finally, with the joint efforts of several peak strong men, the dark-type strong man was finally killed, and the area has since been known as the God Burial Land. It is one of the many dangerous areas in the ancient wilderness similar to the Fisher Wasteland. Very few people will pass through it. But deep down in the very center of the God Burial Land, a magnificent cave was opened up at some point. The cave was more than 10 feet high, and it was cold and dark, with a ghostly wind lingering around it. The blue will-o'-the-wisps inserted on both sides of the cave passage are constantly flickering, giving people an eerie feeling. At this moment, in the main hall at the deepest part of the cave, several figures covered in black robes were sitting on chairs made of rocks in the middle of the cave, looking at each other. Everyone has heard about the sword god sword tomb, right? Our Shadow Killer Alliance's Shadow Killer Nishizawa actually participated in it. What's even more shameful is that Nishizawa not only did not receive the inheritance of the ancient sword god, but he was killed in the sword tomb. With no bones left. How could our Shadow-Killing Alliance endure such a thing? A faint voice sounded in the stone cave, echoing constantly, and the air was full of weirdness. The great wilderness city is too far away from our headquarters. Even if we rush there with all our strength, it will take at least hundreds of years to arrive. In this case, immediately notify the Alliance branch in the southern part of the wild ancient land and ask the branch leader Ming Ming to the Emperor sets out immediately to kill that boy and bring back the inheritance of the ancient sword god. The cold voice echoed in the stone cave. After the words fell, the figure of the black-robed, strong man who was sitting in the middle of the stone cave gradually faded away. And finally completely disappeared into the subcave. In the main city of Manhuang Mansion, a magnificent castle is located on a plain outside the main city. On the outside of the castle, rows of houses stand. Between the houses, groups of soldiers are constantly passing by, with an astonishing momentum. This is where the Lord of the Wilderness Palace lives. The Lord of the Wilderness Palace, the barbarian god Lan En, is one of the 4 great generals under the Dark God King. The messenger of the God King is the invincible existence of the Sun God who is in charge of all areas of this wild ancient land. Prestigious. And those soldiers patrolling near the castle are all soldiers of this wild ancient land. They are sent by the barbarian god Lan. If you want to become this soldier, the weakest one must be the star god, and the main force is the moonlight god, as well as the commander-level figures, are all masters of the sunlight god, with extraordinary strength. Don't underestimate these starry gods. Although it is difficult for the starry gods and moonlight gods to harm the soldiers of the moonlight god in front of the sunlight god, they are only a small part of the moonlight gods. When hundreds of moonlight gods, when the army of gods launches an attack together under the same command, even the strong ones at the level of sun gods would not dare to attack them head-on, let alone thousands of moonlight gods. In a real war, it's the main force. This is the power of the military. At this moment, deep in the most magnificent castle in the middle of the camp, in the luxurious hall, a dark middle-aged man wearing a large cloak and a short horn on his head was sitting cross-legged. Below him, on two sides of the hall, on the side, there are two groups of majestic strong men standing there. Each of them exudes an amazing aura, as if they are gods in their own area. In the center of the hall, the soldier in battle armor was kneeling on one knee, as if reporting something. The ancient sword god is interesting. After listening to the soldier's report, the dark-skinned man sitting there slightly bent his middle finger and tapped lightly on the recliner. If it were normal, I would still be interested in taking such a trip, but now His Majesty, the Dark God King, is having a headache about the stern continent. I'd better not move around at will and stay in the house. If His Majesty the God King has any errands, I can prepare in time. Barbarian God Lon thought for a moment, then raised his head and looked at a strong man on the left. Chi-Ji, I will leave this matter to you. I will activate the teleportation array in the mansion and teleport you to the central city in the south of the ancient wilderness. It is not far from the wilderness city and is only a few months away. When the time comes, Da Huang City, bring me the inheritance of the ancient sword god, do you understand? The rumbling voice of barbarian god Lon and resounded in the hall. Yes, Lord Palace Master. From the crowd on both sides of the hall below, a gentle and elegant middle-aged man walked out, holding a folding fan in his hand, with a graceful demeanor and a respectful voice with a smile on his lips. As the actual controller of the ancient wilderness, the master of a palace, and the controller of barbarian god Lon, he controls several teleportation arrays that can teleport to several central cities in the ancient wilderness. These teleportation arrays were deployed by the Dark God King. Every time it is activated, a large amount of resources will be consumed. Except for the powerful figures in the barbarian god's mansion, it will not be fully activated under normal circumstances, let alone used by other forces. At that moment, Chi-Ji accepted the order from barbarian god Lon and began to head towards the great wilderness city. The wind and clouds gathered together, and many powerful men went to the sword god sword tomb one after another under the orders of their respective forces. Jason, who was in the sword god sword tomb, naturally had no idea what was happening in the ancient wild land. He was completely immersed in the swordsmanship. In the midst of his enlightenment, he fell into seclusion. Time flies by, and Jason has been in seclusion for 20 years. Jason is isolated from the outside world. Surrounded by sword mountains, he realizes the Tao, tempers his body, and understands his own way and path. In the long river of time, 20 years is really nothing, but for Jason, it is an extremely long time. During these 20 years, Jason continued to understand the swordsmanship left by the ancient sword god. The unique skill is to temper one's body, absorb the spiritual energy between heaven and earth, consolidate the realm of Yuehui God, and at the same time, move forward step by step. In 20 years, with the help of the vast sword intention of the ancient sword god, Jason has continuously moved forward and made breakthroughs since he first entered the Moonlight God. When the people know this, I am afraid that every one of them will be stunned and look horrified. After all, 20 years is too short a time. For ordinary people in the heavenly God realm, being able to completely consolidate the realm of Yuehui heavenly God is already considered good. But if they can make small progress and reach the midterm, it will be considered astonishing and genius-like. A character like Jason, who took 20 years to go from first entering the Moonlight Goddess to reaching the peak of the Moonlight Goddess, is simply rare to find in millions of years. The road of a monk is getting narrower and narrower, and every small step forward has to pay a more harsh and huge price than all the previous ones. However, Jason's heart was very calm and he was not surprised. He felt calm and unruffled. After all, the world of gods was too vast. Jason knew clearly in his heart that although his progress seemed amazing, the most indispensable thing in the world was genius, let alone the ancient sword god Moxin, was promoted to the moonlight god at the age of 21, to the sunlight god at the age of 30, and reached the peak of the sunlight god at the age of 40. He was not comparable to him. But what Jason didn't consider was that there was only one person like the ancient sword god Mosin in the history of hundreds of millions of years. In the sword god's sword tomb, the magic medicine swayed, the essence dispersed, and the huge and profound sword intention slowly dissipated from Jason's body. The void was filled with the breath of the sword, and the avenue of the sword shocked the world. 7 dazzling long swords were suspended around Jason, the light lingering and dazzling, as if they had become a part of Jason's body and connected with Jason's soul. Over the past 20 years, Jason has already refined these 7 long swords and connected them to his own soul. What is even more surprising is that these 7 long swords seem to be simply suspended there, but the swords between them are different from each other. The lingering thoughts formed a unique formation, which seemed empty and peaceful, but the murderous intention hidden within it was shocking at every step, shocking both ancient and modern times. This is the 7 killing god-killing sword formation, created by the ancient sword god Mosin. In the past 20 years, Jason has completely understood the 7 killing god-killing sword formation and turned it into a true part of his strength. This is probably something that the ancient sword god Mosin himself did not expect. After all, if you want to completely control the 7 killing god-slaying sword formation, you don't just have to comprehend the sword intention of the ancient sword god. The inheritor must also have extremely powerful attainments in the formation. This extremely powerful achievements are not simply described by a 3rd-level formation master or a 4th-level formation master, but a deeper level of formation. When he first obtained the 7 killing god-killing sword formation, Jason was only a 4th-grade peak formation master who could barely enter the scope of the 5th-grade formation. However, in the process of comprehending the 7 killing god-killing sword formation, Jason's understanding of the formations became deeper and deeper, and finally, he reached the peak of the 5th-grade formations and was worthy of entering the realm of the 6th-grade formations. In other words, Jason can now create 5th-grade formations at his fingertips. Even some simple 6th-grade primary formations can be used, arranged, and even cracked by Jason. In the god realm, those who have reached the 3rd level of formation can be called formation masters, and those who have reached the 4th level of formation can be called masters and become the guests of all major forces. As for the 5th level formation masters, they will not be able to do so in the entire god realm. Beyond the number of 5 fingers, Jason could reach this level at the beginning, and above the 6th level formation, according to what the god of war of the sea said that day, there was no one else besides him in the whole world of gods. Although Jason doesn't know which era this Tianhai war god belongs to, even if the times continue to develop, a 6th-grade formation master is rare in the world of gods for billions of years. In other words, Jason is now in the formation. In terms of Dharma attainments, he has vaguely reached the top of the world of gods. Boom. 20 years later, Jason, who had been sitting there quietly cross-legged and never moved at all, suddenly opened his eyes at this moment. 2 bright rainbows tore through the sky directly. They were just 2 glances, but at this moment, it was like a sword was unsheathed, unleashing a sword light that spanned the 10 realms of the 9 provinces, and was invincible. Boom. Jason stood up, the void trembled, thousands of sword intentions dispersed, and everything around him seemed to tremble and rumble under Jason's body. At this moment, the entire sword god sword tomb roared loudly, and countless sword mountains could not help but tremble, as if they could not bear the sword intent. Thousands of rainbow lights flashed, shocking the world under Jason's actions. This is the result of the fusion between oneself and the Tao. Every move contains the rules of the Tao, which is powerful and intimidating. After acquiring the black ape, after 20 years of fusion, the black épée has been fused with the heart of the ancient sword god. 20 years of sacrifices have given Jason a sense of flesh and blood connection with it, like arm-driven, flexible and free. The cold feeling was transmitted to Jason's mind. With a slight wave, the sword intent that filled the air seemed to pierce a hole in the sky. The sword intention was vast, the sword energy soared into the sky, Jason's eyes were closed, and the divine light was restrained. Gradually, his whole person began to become ordinary, and there was no longer any fluctuation of spiritual power in his body. He was just like an ordinary person, returning to his original nature. In the open space in front of Jason, 3 high-grade sword grasses swayed in the wind, and the 3-inch sacred tree in the center of the 3 sword grasses was even more crystal clear, with flowing brilliance and full of vitality. It was obviously better than the one Jason brought with him. When I entered the realm of gods, it was much better, and there was no sign of sluggishness at all. What surprised Jason even more? After these 20 years of absorption and consumption, the 3 high-grade sword grasses not only showed no signs of energy loss, but were full of vitality, adding even more charm. Sword grass, as the name suggests, is an elixir that grows under the will of the sword. The reason why these 3 sword grasses can surpass the other sword grasses in the Sword Tomb and Sword Mountain and reach the level of top-grade magic medicine is entirely because of their growth. At the bottom of the lake of sword intent, I have been baptized by the sword intent for hundreds of millions of years, and I have achieved what I am today. But the sword intention of this lake of sword intention is powerful. It is the shocking sword intention left by the ancient sword god, but the ancient sword god has long since fallen, and the sword intention in this lake of sword intention is just a dead thing, although it has artistic conception. But there is no vitality. During the 20 years of Jason's seclusion and practice, he absorbed the sword intention of the ancient sword god and obtained the inheritance of the ancient sword god. The sword intention emanating from Jason became more integrated with the avenue and became more integrated with the avenue. The fusion of heaven and earth. In such an environment, these 3 sword grasses have been absorbed by Blue Moon Goosen for 20 years. Instead of withering due to the dissipation of their essence, they have become more lush and dazzling. At this point, even Jason didn't expect it at first. Now that my sword intention has been fulfilled, I have fully mastered the ancient sword god's inheritance. More importantly, Lanui Goosen will not fall in a short time. In this way, I will have enough time to explore in this world of gods, looking for the location of the saint. Jason murmured to himself, looking around, looking at the familiar scene, but there was a trace of emotion in his heart. Sad. It's time for me to leave this place where I have been in seclusion for 20 years. Jason bowed deeply to the place where the sword mountain filled the sky. This was a salute full of respect for the ancient sword god, and it was also a deep tribute to him. Thanks. Boom. The next moment, Jason waved his hand. The sword light on the 7 long swords suspended in midair was bright, and a vast sword intent spurted out. Colorful rays of light flowed, and a colorful passage suddenly appeared in the void. Jason waved his hand and put the 7 divine swords into the God of War tower between his eyebrows. At the same time, he stepped out and stepped into the colorful passage. Outside the ancient mountains where the sword god Sword Tomb is located, there is silence at the moment and no one is around. At that time, 23 starry gods came out of it, attracting the covetousness of many forces. In the end, Bahem, the powerful blood shadow crazy blade of the sunlight god, appeared and obtained the truth, which shocked the entire ancient land. Now, 20 years have passed, everything seems peaceful, but in fact, there are dangers everywhere. The city closest to here, Dahuang City, has seen how many powerful people have arrived in these years, attracting attention. In the wilderness city back then, the powerful people at the level of star god were the pinnacle figures, the powerful people at the level of moon god were commonplace but could not be seen, and the people at the level of sun god were only legendary existences. However, in the past 20 years, the people of Dahuang City have come to know what it means to have people outside the world and heaven outside the world. Powerful men who could only be heard about in the past appeared one after another and came to this deserted city. Among them, the Xingyao god could be seen everywhere, and there were countless moonlight gods. Even the strong men at the sunlight god level would occasionally reveal their whereabouts. These people, there is only one purpose for coming to Dahuang City, and that is the ancient sword god sword tomb. In the first few years, many forces and strong men from other cities came and stationed outside the sword god sword tomb. They also attacked the sword god sword tomb with the idea of the treasures in the sword tomb, but they failed. None of them succeeded, and many strong men even fell under the counterattack of Jianzhong, which gave them the opportunity to move. However, as the number of powerful people increased in the past 10 years, no other family had ever considered the sword god sword tomb, and they all retreated from that area. This is not because they don't covet him, but because of the arrival of 5 powerful men. Barbarian God Mansion Qiji, Fire Cloud Castle Longtas, Shadow Killing Alliance Underworld Emperor, Linghuang Pavilion Thuras, and Blood Shadow Crazy Blade Bahem. In fact, in terms of power, Qiji, who came from the Barbarian God Mansion and carried the orders of Barbarian God Lan, the master of the barbaric ancient land, was naturally the #1 person. In the entire barbaric ancient land, no one dared to go against the Barbarian God Mansion. With his arrival, immediately many forces retreated, and even some families with powerful sunshine gods gave up their ambitions to seize the treasure. However, due to the fall of Bottomus, Shura, Nishizawa, and others, forces such as Fire Cloud Castle, Shadow Killing Alliance, Linghuang Pavilion and others were unwilling to leave like this. As one of the 13 major forces in the ancient wilderness, there are many experts, although they are not as good as the Barbarian God Palace, but they are not able to retreat directly, so they also stay there. As for Bahem, the Blood Shadow Crazy Sword, he is alone and has no power behind him, but as the first strong man of the Sun God to come to the Sword God Sword Tomb, how can he be willing to give up like this? In addition, he has far more power than with the strength of the ordinary Sun God, he could barely stay stationed. In addition, the other families and forces have already withdrawn their main forces and withdrawn from the competition, leaving only some personnel here to observe the situation. The mountains outside the Sword God Sword Tomb are continuous and towering. They are peaceful, full of tranquility and peace. Suddenly boom! A deafening roar resounded throughout the world, and the whole world seemed to shake under this loud noise. The Sword God Sword Tomb, which had been silent for 20 years and had never moved at all, suddenly bloomed with colorful colors at this moment. The divine rainbow is full of life again. In several valleys outside the Sword God Sword Tomb, following this huge roar, 5 sharp eyes suddenly burst out from them, looking at the location of the Sword God Sword Tomb. After waiting for 20 years, this moment has finally arrived. Huh! The colorful rays of light continued to linger over the Sword God Sword Tomb, and waves of sword intent spread out, and the magnificent power swept in all directions. 5 figures flew out at the same time, glaring coldly at the colorful passage that appeared not far away, with cold expressions. Everyone, this inheritance of the ancient sword god is what the barbarian god of the Barbarian God Palace needs. Do you want to disobey the order of the barbarian god? In the sky, Qiji, who had a face like a crown and a folding fan in his hand, scanned the scene. The other 4 people spoke indifferently. Qiji, you can't say that. No one knows what the ancient sword god's inheritance is. I think what Lord Barbarian God is curious about is just the origin of the ancient sword god. With Lord Barbarian God's status and some of the treasures of the ancient sword god will definitely be looked down upon by their strength, but our Linghuang Pavilion family has a small business, so we are a little interested in them. Thuras of Linghuang Pavilion is a man with gray beard and hair. The old man had piercing eyes, and his voice was extremely loud and full of energy. Oh? Qiji glanced at Soros, and a brilliant light flashed in his eyes. At the same time, his eyes also glanced at the remaining 3 people. Qiji, our fire cloud castle is not interested in the inheritance of the ancient sword god, but that kid killed my fire cloud castle's young master bottoms. Our castle master was extremely angry, and I, Longtas, will naturally do my best. Take that kid's head back, otherwise, what's the status of Fire Cloud Castle in the ancient wilderness? Fire Cloud Castle Rontas said calmly, his eyes filled with murderous intent. As for the Shadow Emperor and the Blood Shadow Crazy Blade Bahem of the Shadow Killing Alliance, they remained silent and just stared at the colorful passage that appeared. Knowing that they were unwilling to give up, Chi-Ji could only snort in his heart, turned his head and stopped talking. Although the mansion of the Wild God is powerful and is the actual controller of the Wild Ancient Land, the 13 major forces in the Wild Ancient Land, such as Linghuang Pavilion, Shadow Killing Alliance, and Fire Cloud Castle, are also extremely large and have great power in the Wild Ancient Land. Prestige. One's own reputation can intimidate others, but these forces will not back down easily, plus they are well known. Even the Man-God Palace cannot make them withdraw from this competition, and once they finally get the inheritance of the ancient sword god and offend the Man-God Palace, the Lord Man-God will definitely not fight with these people for the inheritance of an ancient sword god. The forces launched a war to eliminate them. Chi-Ji knew this very well. It seems that this time I want to complete the mission of Lord Barbarian God perfectly. It is not an easy task. However, anyone who blocks me, Chi-Ji, is my enemy. Chi-Ji's eyes suddenly a fierce light flashed. The murderous intention is evident. Boom! There was a loud roar, and in everyone's eyes, a figure walked out of the colorful passage. Appearing in front of everyone, it was Jason, who had come out of seclusion in the Sword God Sword Tomb for 20 years. This is, as soon as Jason came out of the Sword God Sword Tomb, he immediately felt 5 sharp auras falling on him in an instant. Each of these 5 auras was extremely terrifying, making him reach the moonlight level now. Jason, who was at the peak of being a god, couldn't help but feel awestruck in his heart, feeling a strong sense of crisis. At the same time, his eyes also fell on the 5 Chi-Ji people floating there not far away. His pupils couldn't help but shrink. The strong sun god? Jason said indifferently, looking at the 5 Chi-Jis not far away, his face had returned to calm. You are also here for the inheritance of the ancient sword god? For himself, Jason had already thought of many possibilities for the situation he was about to face after leaving the sword tomb. This was why he had asked the World Chamber of Commerce to escape early. The reason why he practiced hard in the Sword God Sword Tomb for 20 years was not only to have enough time for Lan Yugusin to absorb the elixir essence, but also to consolidate his own strength. But now that 5 strong Sunyao gods appeared at once, he was still greatly surprised. The 5 powerful sun gods really think highly of me. But looking at the distance between the 5 of them and their eyes, it's obvious that they are not from the same force. Jason's heart was as bright as a mirror. Boy. As long as you know, hand over the inheritance of the ancient sword god, and I will leave you a whole corpse. In the sky, Thuras slowly spoke out, and an unusually powerful aura burst out, roaring like a flood. Then, he came down and pressed against Jason in front. Hand over the inheritance of the ancient sword god and leave me a whole body? Who do you think you are? The terrifying aura came, and the pressure containing the ultimate consciousness of the sunlight god came down, but Jason's body shook slightly, and then he raised his head and spoke with an indifferent expression on his lips. If this Thuras had appeared 20 years ago, when Jason had just received the inheritance of the ancient sword god, Jason might still be wary of it. But now 20 years later, he has achieved great success in formations and sword intent, and has completely realized it. Jason, who has a thorough understanding of the inheritance of the ancient sword god Mosin, is not so immune to a sun god like Thuras. This kid in the distance, many members of the major forces hiding in the mountains and forests, looking at this scene in shock, could not help but exclaim in admiration. Facing the 5 powerful sun gods, Jason actually kept his expression calm and talked eloquently. Such a demeanor and mentality were far beyond what they could fathom. For a moment, while they felt pity for Jason, they also felt a hint of admiration. Humph, I am Thuras, the Supreme Elder of Linghuang Pavilion. Boy, do you know that you will definitely die today? If you hand over the sword god inheritance obediently, you may be able to get a whole corpse. Otherwise, I can't guarantee that others will too. As easy to talk as I am, you know, people like Lontas of Fire Cloud Castle and Hades Emperor of Shadow Kill Alliance would like to tear you into pieces. Soros of Linghuang Pavilion sneered. Oh? It turns out that Your Excellency is the Linghuang Pavilion where Shura is. Back then, that Shura was rude to me, but he was killed by me with all my strength. Not even the body was left. Today, Your Excellency did almost the same thing as him. I think the ending is different. There won't be any changes. You boy, since you don't have to drink wine as a penalty, I will let you see clearly today what the power of the strong sunlight god is. Soros' face darkened, his voice was cold, and a black spear suddenly appeared in his hand. The big hand holding the handle of the gun shook suddenly, and a terrifying divine power surged out. The black spear shook like a dragon, and a snake stretching, turned into a long black shadow of more than 10 feet, tore through the sky, and smashed towards Jason's location like a whip. When the big gun was blasted, it was like a mountain collapsing, violent sonic booms continued to sound, and a huge crack was torn open in the void, covering Jason. The powerful sun god can tear apart the void and destroy the sky and the earth with just a single movement of his hands. He possesses unpredictable strength. He is also compatible with the great Tao. The power of his actions is far beyond what the powerful moonlight god can match. This is the first time I have seen the sun god. Let me see what kind of strength this sun god has. Seeing Thuras take action, Jason's eyes were solemn, but there was no fear in his heart. Over the past 20 years, his strength has grown by leaps and bounds, and now he also wants to know what level he has reached. Whoa! With a thought, the black épée behind Jason suddenly fell into his hand. Facing Thuras' attack, Jason did not dodge. He raised the black épée in his hand and fiercely faced Thuras and slapped him. The big black gun fell without any intention of avoiding it. What, this kid actually took it hard? Jason's actions immediately made Chi-Ji and others on the side look stunned. Based on the strength of several of them, it can be naturally seen that although the aura on Jason's body is condensed at this moment, it is only at the peak of the moonlight god, and has not yet broken through to the sunlight god. And Thuras made a fierce move towards Jason, but he didn't move at all, but the divine power in his body was condensed, and it was just because they wanted to see what kind of strength Jason, who looked unchanged in front of them, could be so arrogant. However, now that Jason was wielding his sword to meet Thuras' attack, it was almost unimaginable for them. There are so many differences between the moonlight god and the sunlight god. In the world of gods, there are also some moonlight gods who can slightly resist the sunlight god, but most of them rely on their physical skills and special abilities to sway under the sunlight god. And like Jason would not have the slightest chance of winning in such a direct and forceful attack. I am afraid that in one move, he would be completely beaten to a pulp, and his body and soul would be destroyed. For a moment, the divine power in Chi-Ji and others' bodies was running wildly, and their eyes were shining brightly. They were waiting for Jason's death to seize the things on his body and search for his soul and the divine chain of laws. Boom! In the void, the black sword shadow and the black gun shadow collided heavily. In the loud sound, the void where the two collided instantly collapsed, and a huge black hole appeared. At the same time, an astonishing sword Iha's overwhelming divine power rippled in the void, and wherever it passed, the void was shattered layer by layer like a broken mirror. In the endless divine radiance, Jason retreated slightly, and Soros also retreated. The two were actually evenly matched. What? Chi-Ji and the others, who had been preparing to take action like lightning at the last moment to seize Jason's belongings, were stunned for a moment, and the flying figures were stopped abruptly by them. This kid actually blocked Thuras' attack? Everyone was stunned, and some couldn't believe their eyes. However, the one who was most surprised was Thuras. His right hand was trembling slightly. In the previous confrontation, a sword intent so powerful that he could hardly resist surged into his right arm. If it weren't for the divine power in his body, the vastness wiped out the sword intent in an instant, and I am afraid that his right arm had already exploded. However, despite this, his right hand still trembled a little, and he suffered a big hidden loss. "Damn it, you brat, you're looking for death." When Chi-Ji and others saw his embarrassed appearance, Soros couldn't help but feel very angry. His face turned red, he roared, and he took action against Jason again. Demon-suppressing divine gun. Roared, and terrifying gun shadows suddenly appeared in the sky and earth. There were thousands of them. They were vast and unparalleled, like a tide, rushing towards Jason's location crazily. At this moment, the color of the sky and the earth changed, the sun and the moon lost their brightness, and the whole world seemed to have fallen into chaos. Only the shadows of guns in the sky were terrifying, sweeping everything. Boom! The void shook, terrifying power impacted, the sky was filled with cracks, and the mountains below seemed to be shattered by this blow. Thuras held a black spear, like a demon standing proudly in the void. The spear shook, the mountains rolled down, and the world collapsed. In an instant, only the shadow of the gun in the sky swept across the entire world, annihilating everything. The way of the sword is respected, and all swords return to the clan. Jason held the black épée in his hand, and waves of monstrous sword intent spurted out from his body, overwhelming the sky and the earth. Black sword shadows floated above his head. The sword intent condensed quickly, and finally swept across the sky. Out of the sky, sword shadows and gun shadows collided fiercely in the void. Bang! Like a flash flood or a volcano erupting, two terrifying forces collided, and an extremely powerful wave suddenly erupted. The trees in the mountains below were directly broken in half, and the strong wind roared. "Sweep away!" Boom! The roar resounded, and several mountain peaks below the two people collapsed. Smoke and dust filled the air. The figures of people hidden nearby were disturbed locusts, fleeing the place quickly. Some figures failed to escape in time. The aftermath of the collision between the two instantly exploded into blood mist, and there was no time to even scream. "Humph, kill me!" Thuras's deafening roar sounded. Thuras's eyes were cold, and his right hand waving the spear danced wildly, turning the spear into a whirlwind. The divine power in his body exploded desperately, and in an instant, that person in the void, the gun shadows all over the sky condensed sharply, forming a huge black spear. Boom! The spear turned into a black stream of light and moved forward sharply. Poof! The tip of the gun shook, and the void in the god realm tore open a huge gap like paper, spreading forward amidst the rumbling explosions. Broken! Jason's eyes were focused, his eyes were like lightning, and his infinite sword intent was concentrated on the black épée in his hand. On the épée, a power that seemed to come from ancient times suddenly revived, and it collided hard with the terrifying gun shadow. Together. Bang! Jason and Soros fought again, and their bodies separated. Soros's face suddenly turned pale. A trace of blood dripped from the corner of his mouth, and a sword intent lingered around him, which was severely wiped away by the divine power in his body. There was also a muffled sound coming from Jason's throat, and a pale color flashed across his face. Obviously, he had been a little traumatized before. You looking at the terrifying sword intent emanating from Jason, Thuras's eyes were full of surprise and disbelief. He obviously didn't expect that Jason could block such an attack from him, and it even made him suffer. A big loss. You, the god of moonlight, were able to block my full blow. This, Thuras's eyes kept flickering, and a wave of waves arose in his heart. Not only him, but Chi-Ji and others not far away were also stunned. They all know Soros' strength very well. Although they have not really fought against each other, with his identity and status in Linghuang Pavilion, he is by no means an ordinary person. Even if he were to face him, he would have to be cautious, extremely vigilant, and try his best. However, now that he was unable to defeat Jason, who was the moonlight god, after repeated attacks, Chi-Ji and the others were inexplicably surprised. Who is the ancient sword god? The black-haired boy in front of me has obtained his inheritance and can actually block Thuris's attack with the power of the moonlight god. Is this what a joke? Everyone shook their heads. My heart was shocked. The five of them can recognize each other's status and even force away the Sun Yao god of many other families. Which one is not famous and powerful, and is not an ordinary existence among the sun gods? But now even the Yu Hui Tian god can't even pack it up. Speaking of which, it is really ridiculous. I must get the inheritance of this ancient sword god. At the same time, the other four people also had such an idea in their minds almost at the same time, an inheritance that could make the Uexihui god and the sunlight god evenly matched. At this moment, the five sun gods could not help but feel excited. Boom! The Hades Emperor of the Shadow-Killing Alliance suddenly rushed forward like lightning at this moment. The dark light in his right hand flickered, grabbing Jason fiercely. Thuris, it's been so long and you can't even take care of a little baby. Let me, Emperor Hades, take care of this for you. Emperor Hades smiled sinisterly and took action like lightning. This Ming Emperor's actions also made Chi-Ji and others startled. The next moment, three terrifying forces surged out at the same time. Boom! A bright fan shadow, a sky-reaching sword, and a giant flaming hammer all swept towards Jason at the same time. You guys, Thuris was stunned for a moment, and then couldn't help but uttered angrily. At this moment, he couldn't care less about mediating the sword conflict in his body. The big black gun in his hand shook and he shot at Jason again. Boom! The five sun gods attacked at the same time, and the vast divine power directly impacted a huge hole in the sky. The power that shocked the world instantly enveloped the mountains. Let's go quickly, get out of here, the astonishing divine power spread out. This terrifying scene shocked all the onlookers present. They didn't care to watch and looked towards the mountains. He ran away desperately. The five sun gods took action together. With such power, as long as a trace of power escapes and affects them, they will instantly fall and be shattered into pieces. The five sun gods really look up to me. Looking at the figures of the five people coming madly at the same time, Jason's eyes instantly became extremely solemn. I can't beat one of the sun gods like Thuris, but two I can't resist it anymore, and five of them won't have any chance of winning at all. It seems that I have to use this move. Lightning flashed in Jason's heart, and at the moment when the five people's attacks arrived, his eyebrows suddenly a colorful divine light burst out. Boom! 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 The seven divine swords suddenly flew out from between Jason's eyebrows and turned into 7 stars suspended in the air. Each of the 7 long swords burst out with unparalleled terrifying power, and 7 bright beams of light suddenly shot into the sky. And rise, towering between heaven and earth. Buzz! The aura of Jidao sword intention spread out, and the aura of chaos was overwhelming, instantly covering the entire mountains, and also wrapped all the 5 Chi-Ji in it. It was the sword formation of the gods that Jason received from the ancient sword god Mozen. Boom! At this time, the attacks of the 5 Chi-Ji fell one after another, but Jason was still standing in front of them before. Now it has completely disappeared, and the attack in his hand has also fallen into space. Between the heaven and the earth, the surrounding fields are vast, and nothing exists anymore. Only the colorful breath of chaos falls like a waterfall, annihilating everything. Is this a formation? Looking at the empty world around him, his vision was blurry, and he couldn't even distinguish a place 1 meter away. The hearts of the 5 Chi-Ji people could not help but be filled with disbelief and trembling. Although the 5 of them were lost in this formation. They couldn't see everything outside clearly, but because they attacked Jason at the same time before, they were extremely close to each other. They could still feel their respective breaths, and couldn't help but slowly leaned closer to each other. This kid is actually a formation master? Chi-Ji and the other 5 people were shocked almost at the same time. Although they themselves are not formation masters, from their perspective, they can naturally see that the formation arranged by Jason is definitely not simple, and it is not comparable to ordinary low-level formations. The 5 people looked at each other with shock in their eyes. However, it would be ridiculous to try to block the 5 of us with this formation. In the crowd, Thuris suddenly sneered. "Open it!" Soros shouted suddenly. The space around his body was completely distorted. Thuris held the black spear in both hands. The black power of the sun god spread on the surface of the black spear. Only by pouring the power of the gods into the artifact can the maximum attack power of the artifact be unleashed. Breaking the sky. Thuris' black spear slammed into the void in front of him. Jason, who had been paying attention to the situation here during the formation, was suddenly shocked to find that the entire god sword formation was shaking slightly. Jason felt shaking in the center of the formation. What about Soros? With Soros as the center, the void within a radius of 10 meters directly exploded and turned into a huge black space hole. A stream of space particles spewed out from the black space hole, washing over the bodies of the 5 Soros people. However, with the strength of their sun gods, this turbulence of space particles is naturally nothing. Space holes appear quickly. In the blink of an eye, it was repaired and compensated by the endless power of space. It was healed in an instant and calm was restored. The entire formation space was still chaotic and hazy, and it was impossible to see everything around it clearly. This Soros and others, who originally had relaxed expressions on their faces, were stunned at this moment. Although the formation is powerful, it actually has great limitations, because the power that a certain level of formation can accommodate is limited. Just like the 3rd level formation, all it can accommodate is the power of the upper spiritual god. Therefore, what it can kill and trap can only reach the upper spiritual god at most. If the Xingyao god is trapped in it, even if the Xingyao god doesn't understand the formation at all, he can still completely destroy the formation with his own strength. Because the 3rd grade formation simply cannot withstand the power of the starry god. Before, under Thuris' full blow, although the void exploded, the formation was not damaged at all and still returned to calm. This shows that the level of this formation is at least the same level as theirs. That is to say, the formation that the boy arranged before was at least a 6th grade formation. For a moment, Soros and others, who had looked very relaxed and not panicked before, could not help but show a trace of fear at this moment. Impossible, how can this kid be so old, how can he arrange a 6th grade formation? Even the entire god realm may not be able to find a 6th grade formation master. There must be other reasons, yes, it must be, so Soros muttered. Open! Destroy it! At the same time, the 4 Chi-Ji roared at the same time and each attacked. Boom! Huge holes kept appearing in the void, but in the blink of an eye, they all returned to normal, and the surroundings were still hazy and chaotic. At this moment, the hearts of the 5 Chi-Ji people suddenly fell to the bottom.